there exists a legend so terrifying that an entire civilization built a wall of ice 700 feet high and 300 miles long just to keep it out. For 8,000 years they've manned that wall. For 8,000 years they've kept watch. And for 8,000 years most people have forgotten why. Tonight we remember. It's your guide through the shadows, welcoming you back to our sanctuary, where the firelight flickers against ancient tales. I invite you to bundle yourself in whatever warmth you can find, because the story we're about to explore carries with it a cold that goes far deeper than mere winter frost. A cold that can stop a beating heart mid-pulse and shatter steel like glass. Imagine standing at the very edge of the world. Before you stretches an endless expanse of white. Not the peaceful white of fresh snow blanketing a meadow, but something that seems to drink in all color, all warmth, all life itself. The air burns your lungs with each breath, and in that terrible silence, broken only by the whisper of wind across ice, you realize something is watching, something ancient, something that was never meant to exist. They were created as weapons. They became something far worse. The White Walkers, or as they're known in the oldest, most terrified whispers, the Others, are beings of ice and death that nearly ended all life in the known world once before. And according to prophecy, they're coming back. But here's what makes this mythology so utterly compelling. These aren't simple monsters from a cautionary tale. They're born from an act of desperation so profound that it damned an entire species. They're the ultimate reminder that some weapons, once forged, can never be controlled. Tonight, we're diving into the lore of the White Walkers, and I promise you, by the time we're finished, you'll understand why the Night's Watch has kept their vigil for 8,000 years. You'll understand why they've never stopped watching. To understand the White Walkers, we must first journey back, far back, to a time so ancient that written history cannot reach it. We must travel to the Dawn Age and the Age of Heroes, when the world of Westeros was young and vastly different from what it would become. This is a time shrouded in mystery, where fact and legend intertwine so thoroughly that separating one from the other becomes an impossible task. But within these myths of the past, we find the seeds of the tragedy that would give birth to the White Walkers. Picture Westeros as it was then, more than 12,000 years before the events we know. The continent is blanketed in ancient forests, vast and untamed, stretching from the frozen north to the warm southern reaches. These are not merely woods, but living cathedrals of weirwood and oak, sentinel and chestnut, where every tree seems to pulse with an ancient awareness. And moving through these forests, living in harmony with the wild places, are the children of the forest. The children were unlike anything that would come after. They stood small in stature, barely reaching the chest of a grown man. But what they lacked in physical size, they more than compensated for in their deep connection to the natural world. Their eyes were large and golden, like those of cats, able to see in the dimmest light. Their skin bore shades of earth and bark, and they dressed in garments woven from leaves and decorated with the materials of the forest. But most importantly, the children possessed magic, true magic, the kind that flows from the very bones of the earth itself. Among the children were those called greenseers, individuals blessed or perhaps cursed with the ability to see through the eyes of animals, to walk in the dreams of men, and most powerfully, to commune with the weirwood trees. These pale trees with their bone-white bark and blood-red leaves were sacred to the children, each one a living record of the past, present, and futures yet to come. The children carved faces into the weirwoods, faces that wept sap like tears, and through these carved faces, the greenseers could see across vast distances and even through the veil of time itself. For thousands of years, the children lived in their forest kingdoms, worshipping the nameless gods of tree and stream and stone. They hunted with the weapons of dragon glass, that black volcanic glass also called obsidian, which they shaped with consummate skill into arrowheads and daggers and spear points. They sang songs to the wind and conversed with the animals of the forest. They built no cities of stone, erected no monuments to their glory. Instead, they lived as part of the land, and the land lived through them. It was a golden age, or so the stories say, a time of harmony between the children and the world they inhabited. But all golden ages must end, and for the children of the forest, the end came from across the sea. The first men, as they would come to be known, arrived in Westeros from the eastern continent of Essos. They crossed via a land bridge called the Arm of Dawn, a natural causeway that once connected the two continents before it was shattered and submerged beneath the waves. These first men were tall and strong, warriors and farmers, ambitious and hungry for land. They brought with them bronze weapons and tools, horses and dogs, and most significantly, they brought a different way of life. One that required cutting down forests to make way for farms. One that saw the land as something to be conquered and claimed rather than lived with. When the first men began to arrive in their thousands, cutting down the ancient weirwoods to clear land for their settlements, the children of the forest saw their sacred world under threat. The weirwoods, those living libraries of memory and magic, were being felled like common lumber. The forests that had stood for thousands of years were burning. The very land itself seemed to cry out in pain, and the children could hear that cry in ways the first men could not. War came, as war so often does, when two peoples compete for the same land. But this was no ordinary conflict. This was a war between magic and bronze, between those who had lived on Westeros since time immemorial and those who saw it as a new frontier to be tamed. The children, despite their small size and seemingly delicate nature, were formidable opponents. They used their superior knowledge of the forests, their ability to communicate with animals, and their mastery of guerrilla warfare to strike at the first men with devastating effect. The children employed powerful magic in their desperate defense. According to the oldest legends, they even attempted to use their greenseer's magic to break the Arm of Dawn itself, to sever the land bridge and prevent more first men from crossing. The ritual was performed, and the Hammer of the Waters, as it came to be known, shattered the arm into the chain of islands now called the Stepstones. The sea rushed in, swallowing the land bridge, but it was too late. Thousands upon thousands of first men had already crossed, and more came by ship. The war continued for years, perhaps even centuries. The children fought with everything they had, using their dragon glass weapons, their warg abilities to control animals, and their deep connection to the land itself. But the first men kept coming, kept pushing deeper into the forests, kept building their ring forts and settlements. The children were dying, their sacred groves burning, their weirwoods falling beneath bronze axes. And it was in this context of desperation, of a people seeing their entire world threatened with extinction, that the terrible decision was made. The decision that would haunt Westeros for all the ages to come. There is a place in the far north of Westeros, beyond where even the wall would eventually stand, where the earth itself seems locked in eternal winter. The ground is frozen so hard that it rings like iron when struck, and the cold there is not merely an absence of warmth, but a presence in itself, a force that seeks out any living thing and slowly, inexorably, draws the heat from it. In the time of the children's war with the first men, this place already existed, already called to those with the power to hear it. And it was here, or perhaps in a sacred grove thick with weirwood trees, that a small group of children of the forest made a choice that would alter the fate of the world. Among the children were those with the greatest power, the most potent greenseers, individuals who could reach deeper into the old magic than any others of their kind. One of these was called Leaf, though whether that was truly her name or merely how she came to be known in the stories is lost to time. These greenseers came together in council, their great golden eyes filled with sorrow and determination in equal measure. They had seen their people decimated, their forest burning, their sacred trees falling beneath the axes of the invaders. The war was being lost. Something had to be done, something drastic, something that had never been attempted before. The children of the forest were not warlike by nature. Their magic was the magic of growth and green things, of communication and understanding. But magic is a tool, and tools can be turned to purposes their makers never intended. The greenseers theorized that if they could take the very thing the first men used against them, their strength, their lack of fear, their relentless drive, and combine it with magic, they could create a weapon, not a sword or a spear, but something living, something that could fight the first men, with a power beyond anything the invaders had ever encountered. They needed a subject for their dark work, and so they captured one of the first men. Who he was, whether he was a warrior or a farmer, young or old, willing or forced, these details are lost to the ages. What we know is that he was brought to a weirwood tree, one of those pale sentinels with its carved face, weeping red sap like tears. The children bound him to the tree, and as he struggled or perhaps stood resigned to his fate, they performed a ritual that would echo through history. One of the children, Leaf herself according to some accounts, held a blade of dragon glass. This was not a weapon shaped for hunting or war, but a sacred implement, a shard of volcanic glass that had been prepared specifically for this moment. The dragon glass glowed with an eerie light, pulsing with the magic that the children had infused into it. And with hands that may have trembled, Leaf pressed the shard of dragon glass into the man's chest, directly over his heart. What happened next was a transformation beyond horror. The magic of the children met something else, something cold and ancient that had been waiting in the frozen places of the world. The man's eyes, which may have been brown or blue or green, began to change. The color drained from them, replaced by an unnatural glowing blue, bright as sapphires, cold as winter ice. His skin, whatever its natural tone, began to pale, not the pallor of death, but something else, something that seemed to drink in the very concept of color and warmth. His body convulsed, but not in death, in transformation. The first man was gone. What stood before the children of the forest was something new, something that had never existed before in all the long history of the world. The first of the White Walkers had been born, or perhaps more accurately, created, forged, made into a weapon that the children did not fully understand and certainly could not control. The newly created White Walker stood silent, but his silence was not empty. It was filled with a cold awareness, an alien intelligence that looked at the children who had made him not with gratitude, but with something that might have been hunger. The air around him grew, frigid, frost forming on the weirwood bark, on the ground, on the very leaves of the trees. When he moved, it was with an uncanny grace, each motion deliberate and purposeful, like a predator that knows its own deadly capability. The children had sought to create a weapon against the first men, a guardian that would defend their forests and their people. What they had actually created was something far more terrible. The White Walker possessed strength beyond any natural man, resilience that made him nearly impossible to kill, and an affinity for cold and ice that turned the very elements into instruments of war. But more than this, he possessed an agenda of his own, a will that was not bound to the children who had created him. And then came the true horror of what the children had done. The White Walker could create more of his kind, not in the same way that he had been created. The ritual with the weirwood and the dragon glass was the children's magic, but through a different process. The White Walker could take the newborn sons of men, babes still soft and innocent, and with a touch transform them. The cold would flow from him into the child, and the child would become like him, another of these creatures of ice and death. The children had not merely created one weapon, they had created a species that could propagate itself, that could grow in number, that could, if left unchecked, overrun the entire world. It didn't take long for the children to realize their mistake. The White Walkers, rather than serving as guardians of the forests, began to spread. They moved through the northern reaches like a creeping cold, and where they went, life withered. Trees died, animals fled or froze, and the ground itself became sterile and lifeless. The White Walkers began to raise the dead, another power that the children had not anticipated, turning the corpses of men and animals into mindless soldiers, whites they would come to be called, that served the walkers with absolute obedience. The weapon had turned on its makers. The White Walkers did not distinguish between the first men and the children of the forest. To these new creatures of ice, all life was the enemy, all warmth something to be extinguished. The children found themselves facing a threat far worse than the first men could ever have been, a threat that they themselves had unleashed upon the world. And so, in one of history's great ironies, the children of the forest were forced to ally with their enemies. The first men and the children, who had been locked in a brutal war for years, or perhaps centuries, now had to put aside their differences to face a common enemy that threatened to consume them both. Together, they would forge what became known as the Pact, an agreement to end their war and live together in peace. Together, they would stand against the darkness that the children's desperation had unleashed. But first, they would have to survive what was coming. For the White Walkers were gathering in the frozen north, building their strength, raising their armies of the dead, and soon, very soon, they would descend upon the world in a catastrophe that would be remembered for thousands of years as the Long Night. The children's creation had become the world's nightmare, and winter was coming. There is a particular kind of fear that comes with the deepening of winter, when the days grow short and the nights stretch long, when the cold seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear or how close you huddle to the fire. It's a primal fear, one that our ancestors knew well, the fear that the sun might not return, that the warmth might never come back, that the darkness will simply continue forever until everything freezes and dies. Now imagine that fear realized. Imagine a winter that doesn't end, not for weeks or months, but for years, for decades, for an entire generation. Imagine darkness falling across the world and not lifting, not even for a moment, while that terrible cold grows deeper and deeper, reaching into every corner of the land, into every home, into every heart. This is what the Long Night was, and it stands as perhaps the single most catastrophic event in all the recorded and half-remembered history of the known world. The Long Night began approximately 8,000 years before the Targaryen conquest of Westeros, though the exact dating is impossible to verify. What we know comes from legends, from songs, from stories passed down through so many generations that they've taken on the quality of myth. But there's a consistency to these stories, a common thread that suggests they're based on something terribly real. From the frozen lands of Westeros to the distant reaches of Essos, from Yeti in the far east to the Rhoyne in the west. Cultures that had never contacted each other all have tales of the same event, a time when darkness fell and winter reigned without end. In Westeros, the Long Night is said to have come during a winter that had already lasted for years. The realm was in the grip of cold such as had never been known before, and people were beginning to fear that spring might never return. And then, one day, the sun didn't rise. Not in the sense that it was hidden behind clouds. The sun simply didn't appear. Day became indistinguishable from night, or perhaps more accurately, there was no day at all, only an endless night broken occasionally by the dim glow of the moon and stars. How long did this darkness last? The stories say a generation, meaning that children were born, lived their entire lives, and died without ever seeing the sun. Imagine that. Imagine being born into darkness and cold, knowing nothing else, with only the fading memories of your elders to tell you that there was once such a thing as warmth and light. The psychological impact alone would be devastating, to say nothing of the practical effects on agriculture, on survival, on the very will to continue living. But the darkness itself was only part of the horror. For into this endless night came the White Walkers. They emerged from the lands of always winter, that frozen wasteland in the uttermost north, where no man dared venture. At first, they came in small numbers, scouts perhaps, testing the borders of the world of men. But soon they came in force, an army of ice and death that moved south with terrible purpose. And before them, they drove a wave of the dead. The Whites were perhaps even more terrible than the White Walkers themselves, in their own way. These were the corpses of the recently slain, raised by the Walkers' magic to serve as mindless soldiers in their army. A White felt no pain, knew no fear, required no rest. You could cut off its arm and it would keep coming. You could stab it through the heart and it would not fall. Only fire or the complete destruction of the body could stop a White. And in that frozen darkness, fire was precious and rare. Imagine defending your home against such an enemy. You fight them off, you kill a dozen or more, and you think perhaps you've won, perhaps you're safe. But then the White Walkers arrive, and with a gesture, all those you've just killed rise again, this time to fight for the enemy. Your friends, your family, everyone who falls becomes another soldier for the darkness. It's an army that grows stronger with every battle it fights, feeding on the very people trying to stop it. The terror spread across Westeros like wildfire, or rather, like the opposite of wildfire, like a creeping frost that consumed everything it touched. The White Walkers and their Whites swept across the north, leaving nothing but frozen corpses and silent villages in their wake. They moved with a cold that went beyond natural winter, a supernatural chill that could freeze a man solid in moments, that made steel brittle as glass, that killed crops and livestock and any living thing it touched. The The stories from that time, the ones that survived in legend and song, paint a picture of unimaginable horror. They tell of entire families found frozen in their homes, their expressions still showing the terror they felt in their final moments. They speak of huge dire wolves growing gaunt and desperate with hunger as all the prey animals fled south or died. They describe snow falling so thick and so endlessly that villages were buried, their inhabitants entombed in white until spring finally came decades later to reveal the mummified dead. But Westeros was not the only land to suffer. Across the narrow sea in Essos, the same darkness fell. The Rhoynish people, those ancestors of the Dornish, have legends telling of the mother river Rhoyne freezing solid as far south as the Seloru tributary, something that should be impossible given the warm climate of that region. They speak of the waters turning to ice so thick that armies could march across it, and of things moving beneath that ice, pale shapes with glowing blue eyes. In GoT, at the far eastern edge of the known world, they don't call it the Long Night, but instead speak of the Lion of Night, a great demon of darkness unleashed upon the world. Their legends tell that the sun hid its face in shame, though what it was ashamed of, none can say. A hero arose there, just as heroes arose in Westeros, to fight against the darkness. Different cultures, different names, but the same event, the same catastrophe, the same desperate struggle for survival. The devastation was total and world-spanning. Famine gripped the land as crops failed in the endless dark and cold. People burned everything they could find for warmth and light. Furniture, books, even the bodies of the dead, when there was nothing else. Civilization itself began to crumble as people abandoned cities and towns, fleeing ever southward, trying to stay ahead of the advancing cold and the armies of the dead. Old Nan, that ancient storyteller of Winterfell whose tales were passed down through generations, described the long night in words that still have the power to chill. Fear is for the long night, when the sun hides its face for years at a time, and little children are born and live and die all in darkness, while the direwolves grow gaunt and hungry, and the White Walkers move through the woods. Those last words are perhaps the most terrifying. And the White Walkers move through the woods, not rushing, not attacking with wild fury, but moving through the woods, patient, inevitable, relentless, knowing that time was on their side, that the cold and dark were their allies, that they could simply wait for the living to freeze and starve and die before claiming them for their army. It seemed, for a time, that the world of men would end, that the children of the forest, who had seen the first men as destroyers of their ancient ways, would perish alongside them, that all life, all warmth, all light would be extinguished, leaving only the endless winter and the cold gods who ruled it. The White Walkers appeared unstoppable, and the darkness appeared eternal. But in humanity's darkest hour, heroes arose. In different lands, they had different names, but they all served the same desperate purpose: to hold back the night, to preserve the spark of life, to fight against the darkness even when all seemed lost. These heroes, these warriors of light and fire, would become the stuff of legend themselves, and so began the battle for the dawn, the last desperate stand of humanity against the creeping cold, the final struggle between life and death, between the warmth of the human heart and the icy eternity the White Walkers promised. In the deepest darkness, when hope seems nothing more than a childish dream and survival feels impossible, that's when heroes are truly born. Not the heroes of songs and stories necessarily, but the kind who simply refuse to surrender who keep fighting not because they expect to win, but because the alternative is unthinkable. The battle for the dawn was filled with such heroes, and though most of their names are lost to time, their deeds echo down through the ages. One figure stands above all others in the legends of Westeros, the last hero. His story is fragmentary, pieced together from half-remembered songs and tales told by firelight, but it captures something essential about the human spirit in the face of overwhelming darkness. The last hero, the legends say, was a warrior who set out during the long night with 12 companions, seeking the children of the forest to ask for their aid against the White Walkers. Can you imagine that journey? Setting out into the endless darkness and cold, knowing that the White Walkers hunted in those frozen wastes, that their whites patrolled the night, that even the weather itself had become a weapon of the enemy. The last hero and his companions rode north, deeper into the regions the White Walkers had claimed, carrying with them nothing but their courage and a desperate hope that the children might know some way to stop the creatures they had created. One by one, his companions fell. The cold took some. Their bodies found frozen in their saddles, their faces turned to the north as if still searching for salvation. The White Walkers took others, their screams echoing across the frozen waste before being cut short. The last hero's horse died beneath him. His sword, fine steel though it was, became so brittle from the supernatural cold that it shattered. Even his loyal hound, faithful to the end, finally succumbed to the cold and lay down to die in the snow. But the last hero kept going. Alone, on foot, weaponless, he continued north. And somehow, through determination or luck, or perhaps the intervention of the old gods themselves, he found the children of the forest. They took him in, sheltered him, and together, man and child, they forged an alliance that would turn the tide of the war. What exactly happened next is unclear, lost in the mists of legend. Some stories say the last hero learned the secrets of killing the White Walkers, discovering that dragon glass and the rare Valyrian steel could shatter them. Others suggest the children taught him ancient magic, songs of power that could break the Walkers' hold on the dead. Whatever the truth, the last hero returned from his quest bearing knowledge, and with that knowledge, humanity began to fight back. But Westeros was not the only land to produce heroes in this dark hour. Across the sea in Essos, in the ancient land of Asshai at the edge of the world, another legend was being born. This hero would be known by many names depending on which culture told his tale. Azor Ahai in Asshai, Hyrkoon the hero in distant lands, Eldrick Shadow Chaser in still others. But his story remains remarkably consistent. Azor Ahai was a warrior who understood that conventional weapons would not suffice against the darkness. He needed something more. Something forged not just with steel and fire, but with magic and sacrifice. And so he set about creating Lightbringer, a sword that would become perhaps the most legendary weapon in all the known world. The forging of Lightbringer is a tale of determination and terrible sacrifice. Azor Ahai labored for 30 days and 30 nights to forge the blade, working without rest, pouring all his skill into its creation. When he was done, he had crafted a sword of incredible beauty and balance. But a blade is not complete until it has been tempered, hardened in a way that makes it strong enough to withstand the rigors of battle. Azor Ahai plunged the blade into water to temper it, as any smith would do. But the sword shattered, the steel proving too brittle, too weak for the purpose he needed. Undaunted, Azor Ahai began again. This time he worked for 50 days and 50 nights, forging an even finer blade, one that should have been stronger, more perfect in every way. To temper this second sword, he captured a lion, itself no easy feat, and drove the blade into the great beast's heart. Surely, he thought, the heart's blood of such a noble creature would give the sword the strength it needed. But again, the steel shattered, unable to bear the magic that Azor Ahai was trying to infuse into it. Azor Ahai knew what he had to do for the third attempt. He knew, and the knowledge must have nearly broken him. For 100 days and 100 nights, he labored over the third blade, each hammer stroke accompanied by the knowledge of what would be required to complete it. When the sword was finished, when it lay glowing and perfect on his anvil, Azor Ahai called for his wife, Nissa Nissa. The stories don't record what she thought when he called her name. They don't tell us if she knew what he planned, if she understood the necessity of what was about to happen. What we know is that Nissa Nissa came to him, and Azor Ahai, with tears streaming down his face, asked her to bare her breast. And then, because the darkness had to be stopped at any cost, because the world needed a weapon that could pierce the heart of winter itself, he drove the blade into her living heart. Her scream of anguish split the night, but it mixed with his own. For in killing the person he loved most in all the world, Azor Ahai had killed a part of himself. But the sacrifice accomplished what cold water and a lion's heart could not. Nissa Nissa's soul combined with the steel of the sword, her life force and her love, and her very essence infusing the blade with power beyond any mundane weapon. When Azor Ahai drew the sword from her chest, it was transformed. Lightbringer, they called it, the red sword of heroes, and it burned with an inner fire that never dimmed, glowing like the sun, radiating heat that drove back the cold, and possessing the power to destroy the White Walkers. With Lightbringer in hand, Azor Ahai led the fight against the darkness. The sword was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol, a beacon of hope in the endless night. Wherever Azor Ahai went, the sword's light drove back the shadows, and the White Walkers fell before its burning edge. The story spread among the desperate peoples of the world. There was a champion, a hero with a sword of fire, and he was winning battles against the darkness. In Westeros, whether through the last hero's knowledge or through their own desperate innovation, humanity discovered other ways to fight the White Walkers. Dragon glass weapons proved effective, the volcanic glass able to shatter the ice creatures with a single strike. Those few who possessed swords of Valyrian steel, that mysterious metal forged with dragonfire and magic, found their blades could cut through the walkers just as effectively. Fire became a weapon as well, though not as reliable as one might hope. The White Walkers could be harmed by fire, but the whites they commanded were the real problem, shambling corpses that would keep coming until they were completely consumed by flame. The defenders learned to create barriers of fire, to use flaming arrows, to set entire forests ablaze rather than let them provide cover for the advancing dead. The battle for the dawn was not a single battle, but rather a long, grinding campaign that stretched across years. Slowly, painfully, at tremendous cost, humanity and the children of the forest began to push back. The White Walkers, for all their power and their armies of the dead, could be killed. They could be defeated. And once humanity knew that, once they had weapons that could actually harm these creatures, the tide began to turn. The White Walkers were driven back north, step by bloody step. Their white armies were burned, their icy weapons shattered against dragon glass and Valyrian steel. The darkness itself began to lift, slowly at first, like the first hint of dawn after the longest night. And then, finally, after a generation of darkness, after uncountable deaths and suffering beyond measure, the sun rose. The long night was over. The White Walkers had been defeated, driven back to the frozen waste from which they'd come. Humanity had survived, though barely, and at a cost that would haunt the collective memory for thousands of years. The world had looked into the abyss and pulled back from the edge of extinction. But those who had lived through the long night, who had fought in the battle for the dawn, knew something that future generations might forget. The White Walkers had not been destroyed, only defeated. They had retreated to the lands of always winter, to the frozen places where the cold never lifted. And they were patient. They could wait. Winter, after all, always comes again. In the aftermath of the long night, as the survivors emerged from their shelters into a world transformed by years of darkness and cold, they faced a question that would shape the future of Westeros. How could they ensure this never happened again? How could they protect the realm from another invasion of the White Walkers? The answer they devised would become one of the greatest construction projects in the history of the known world, and would give birth to an order of warriors whose sworn purpose would endure for 8,000 years. The Wall, even speaking its name, conjures an image of something vast and imposing, something that shouldn't be possible, and yet stands as a testament to what desperation and determination can accomplish. Stretching 300 miles from coast to coast, from the Bay of Seals in the east to the gorge in the west, rising 700 feet into the air, the Wall is more than just a physical barrier. It's a monument to humanity's fear, a fortress against the darkness, a line drawn across the world that says never again. According to legend, the Wall was built by a figure called Brandon the Builder, also known as Bran the Builder, though whether he was a single person or a title passed down through a dynasty of builders is lost to history. What we know is that the first men and the children of the forest came together in the wake of the long night to create something that would bar the passage of the White Walkers should they ever attempt to return south. The Wall is made of ice, but this is not ordinary ice. It's not frozen water that will melt come spring. The Wall's ice has stood for 8,000 years through countless summers, through warm winds and southern storms, and it never melts. This is ice infused with magic, strengthened and sustained by the spells of the children of the forest, and perhaps by the old gods themselves. Some say you can see the magic if you look closely at the Wall's face, swirls of color frozen within the pale blue-white, like aurora lights trapped in eternal winter. Building such a structure would seem impossible even with modern engineering. So how did the people of the Dawn Age accomplish it? The legends offer fragments of answers. Giants helped in the construction, those massive creatures that once roamed Westeros before dwindling to extinction or near extinction. Their strength would have been necessary to move the enormous blocks of ice, to shape them and stack them to such tremendous heights. The children of the forest wove their magic into every foot of the Wall, spells of protection and warding that would prevent the White Walkers from crossing it, that would bind the ice together stronger than any mortar. There's a theory, whispered in the darkest corners of ancient knowledge, that more than just spells were used to power the Wall. Some say that blood magic was employed, that sacrifices were made to bind the Wall's power, to ensure its magic would never fade. The truth of such claims is impossible to verify, but it's certain that the Wall is more than just ice piled high. It's a living magical barrier, still active and potent after 8 millennia. Along the Wall's length, 19 castles were built to house its defenders. These castles, with names like Castle Black, the Night Fort, East Watch by the Sea, were fortresses in their own right, each designed to house hundreds or even thousands of men. But here's something peculiar about their design. They have no walls or fortifications on their southern sides. They're completely open to the south, defenseless against any attack from that direction. This wasn't an oversight or a flaw in their construction. It was intentional, built into their very design to make a statement and enforce a rule. The castles of the wall must never be used against the south, against the very kingdoms they're meant to defend. Their watch is in one direction only, north. North toward the lands of always winter, north toward the darkness, north toward the patient enemy that waits in the frozen wastes. To man these castles, to maintain eternal vigilance against a threat that had retreated into legend, the Night's Watch was founded. This was to be no ordinary military order. The men of the Night's Watch would take vows that separated them from the rest of humanity, oaths that bound them for life, sometimes quite literally forsaking all that made life worth living in exchange for the purpose of defending the realm. The vows of the Night's Watch have remained unchanged for thousands of years, passed down word for word, recited before heart trees and ancient gods. Listen to them and understand what these men give up. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch for this night and all the nights to come. These aren't merely pretty words or ceremonial phrases. They're binding oaths that strip away a man's past and future, leaving only the eternal present of the watch. A man who joins the Night's Watch gives up his family name, his claims to inheritance, his right to marry and have children. He wears only black, earning the watch its nickname as the Crows or the Black Brothers. He holds no allegiance to any king or lord save the Lord Commander of the watch itself. In essence, he ceases to be a person with individual desires and becomes part of something larger. A living shield between the realms of men and the darkness beyond. In the early days, in the years and centuries immediately following the long night, joining the Night's Watch was considered an honor. Men came from all the kingdoms of Westeros to take the black, to serve in the most important defense force the world had ever known. Younger sons of noble houses, knights seeking purpose beyond the petty wars of kings, common men who wanted to be part of something greater than themselves, all came to the wall. The Night's Watch in those early days was a formidable force, numbering in the tens of thousands. They were well equipped, well supplied, and respected throughout the realm. They ranged beyond the wall regularly, exploring the wilderness, mapping the lands of always winter, maintaining watch on the enemy that had retreated but not been destroyed. But as the years turned to decades, as decades became centuries and centuries stretched into millennia, the purpose of the Night's Watch began to fade from the collective memory of the South. The White Walkers became children's stories, monsters to frighten the young into good behavior. The Long Night became myth, a tale too terrible to be true, surely exaggerated in the telling and retelling. As the threat was forgotten, the honor of the watch diminished. Fewer men volunteered to take the black. The great houses stopped sending their sons. The watch began to accept anyone who would come, including criminals given the choice between the wall or death, between taking the black or losing a hand for theft. The ranks filled with rapers and murderers, thieves and poachers, men who wore black not out of honor, but out of desperation. The Night's Watch dwindled. Castles along the wall were abandoned, left empty and crumbling. 19 castles had been built. By the time of recent history, only 3 remained manned: Castle Black, the Shadow Tower, and Eastwatch by the Sea. The force that had once numbered tens of thousands had shrunk to less than 1,000 men, spread thin along 300 miles of wall. Yet despite this decline, despite being forgotten and diminished, the Night's Watch endured. For 8,000 years, men in black cloaks stood watch on the wall. For 8,000 years, rangers ventured beyond into the wilderness. For 8,000 years, the wall stood unbreached, the magic holding, the watch maintaining their vigil. Even as the world forgot why they watched, they continued to watch. Because somewhere in the frozen north, beyond the light of civilization, beyond the reach of kings and their petty games, the White Walkers waited, patient, eternal, cold, and they remembered what the South had forgotten. The wall still stands, a monument 700 feet tall and 300 miles long. The Night's Watch still keeps its vigil, diminished though they may be. The vows are still sworn, the watch still maintained, because winter is always coming, and the night is always dark, and the things that move through the darkness never truly die. They only wait. Among all the dark tales that have come down from the age of heroes, among all the legends of the long night and its aftermath, there is one story that stands apart in its horror and tragedy. It's a tale that blurs the line between history and myth, a story that may be entirely true, partially true, or perhaps just a warning passed down through generations. But true or not, the legend of the Night's King has the power to chill the blood and remind us that the greatest threats sometimes come not from without, but from within. According to the oldest versions of the tale, the Night's King lived not during the long night itself, but in the years after, when the wall had been built and the Night's Watch established to guard against the return of the White Walkers. He was the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, a warrior known for his skill and most notably for his complete absence of fear. In Old Nan's tellings, she would always add with emphasis, and that was the fault in him, for all men must know fear. The Night's King, the stories say, was doing his duty, ranging beyond the wall, or perhaps simply keeping watch from atop its icy heights. And it was there that he saw her, a woman, pale as moonlight, standing in the darkness beyond the wall. Her skin was white as the moon itself, they say, and her eyes were like blue stars, burning with that terrible cold light that marks the White Walkers. Just seeing her should have been enough to send any man running, should have filled him with the terror that keeps us alive in the face of the truly dangerous. But the Night's King knew no fear, or perhaps more accurately, he was incapable of recognizing danger when he saw it. Instead of fleeing or raising the alarm, he felt something else entirely. Desire, love, or what passes for love when it's twisted by magic and darkness. He chased after her, out into the frozen waste beyond the wall, and he caught her, and he loved her, though her skin was cold as ice, though her touch should have warned him that she was something other than human, something deadly. The stories say that when he gave his seed to her, he gave his soul as well. Whether this was literal or metaphorical, the result was the same. The Night's King was transformed, corrupted, turned from the purpose he had sworn to serve. He brought the woman back to the Night Fort, that grim fortress that even then was considered the darkest and most haunted of all the castles on the wall, and there, in that place of shadows and whispers, he declared himself king and her his queen. But the Night's King didn't rule alone or through mere force of arms. He wielded strange sorceries, magics that should not have been available to a man sworn to the Watch. With these dark powers, he bound the brothers of the Night's Watch to his will, enslaving the very men who should have been his brothers and companions. They became his servants, his instruments, forced to obey him in all things, no matter how terrible. For 13 years, the number itself seems significant, doesn't it? The 13th Lord Commander ruling for 13 years, the Night's King and his corpse queen reigned from the Night Fort. What exactly they did during those dark years is hinted at in the tales, but never fully described, as if the specifics are too terrible to speak aloud. The phrase most often used is that horrific atrocities were committed, which leaves the imagination to fill in the gaps with horrors perhaps worse than the reality. We know that the Night's King made sacrifices to the White Walkers, which suggests he was actively serving the very creatures the Night's Watch was founded to fight against. We know that under his rule, the Night's Watch became something twisted, no longer the shield that guards the realms of men, but instead a weapon pointed at the throat of the very people they were meant to protect. The Night Fort, already a grim place, became something worse, a seat of dark power, a place where the boundaries between life and death, between human and other, became dangerously thin. The Night's King's reign might have continued indefinitely if not for an alliance that echoed the one that had won the battle for the dawn. Brandon the Breaker, the King of Winter from House Stark of Winterfell, joined forces with Joramun, who was king beyond the wall, ruler of the wildlings or free folk who lived north of the wall. Think about what this required. The people south of the wall and the wildlings had been enemies, fighting over land and resources, raiding and counter-raiding. But faced with the Night's King and his corrupted Night's Watch, they put aside their differences. Together, this alliance marched on the Night Fort. The details of the battle are lost to time, but they succeeded in bringing down the Night's King and freeing the Night's Watch from his sorcerer's control. When the Night Fort was finally taken and the Night's King defeated, the full extent of his crimes was revealed. The sacrifices to the others, the dark rituals, the transformation of the Watch into something monstrous, all of it came to light. The response was swift and absolute. All records of the Night's King were destroyed. His very name was forbidden, stricken from every book and chronicle, removed from every list of Lord Commanders. Where once there would have been a record of the 13th Lord Commander, now there was only a gap, a blank space where a name should be. Even his identity, whether he had been a Stark, a Bolton, an Umber, or from some other northern house, was deliberately obscured. Different versions of the tale claim him for different houses, but the truth was buried so deeply that it may never be recovered. This wasn't just about punishing the Night's King or erasing a shameful period in the Watch's history. It was about making absolutely certain that no one could ever follow his path again, that the knowledge of whatever dark sorceries he had used would die with him. Better to forget completely than to risk someone else attempting to replicate his crimes. The destruction of records and the forbidding of his name has led to centuries of scholarly debate. Did the Night's King actually exist? Or is he a legend crafted to teach a moral lesson? If he did exist, when exactly did he live? Some argue he was the 13th Lord Commander, as the stories claim. Others suggest he may have lived during the long night itself, that the tale of the Corpse Queen is actually describing one of the female White Walkers, if such things exist. But here's what makes the legend truly chilling. The possibility that it's entirely true, that sometime in the generations after the long night, a Lord Commander of the Night's Watch truly did fall in love with a female White Walker, truly did corrupt the Watch from within, truly did rule as a Dark King, making sacrifices to the very enemy the Watch was meant to fight. Old Nan, whose stories carried the weight of countless generations of telling, would say this about the Night's King. Night's King was only a man by light of day, but the night was his to rule. Think about what that implies. During the day, under the sun, he appeared as any man might appear. But when darkness fell, when night claimed the world, he became something else entirely, something that ruled the night rather than feared it. The legend of the Night's King serves as a reminder, a warning that has echoed through the ages. It warns that the White Walkers are not merely an external threat, but something that can corrupt from within, that can turn the defenders into the very thing they're meant to defend against. It reminds us that the line between human and other, between warmth and cold, between life and death, can sometimes be crossed. And most importantly, it warns that love, or what we call love, can be the most dangerous corruption of all when directed toward things that should not be loved. The Night Fort itself, where the Night's King held his dark court, became the most haunted castle on the wall. Even after it was abandoned, even as it fell into ruin, the stories persisted. Stories of strange sounds in the night, of cold spots that never warmed, of shadows that moved with no source. The Night's Watch eventually abandoned it entirely, and it stood empty for centuries, a monument to a dark period best forgotten. But forgotten or not, the legend persists. Mothers still tell their children the tale of the Night's King, though often in simplified form, a scary story to encourage good behavior. Don't go out in the cold alone, or the Night's King will get you. Never trust a beautiful woman with skin like ice and eyes like stars. The warnings persist even as the true depth of the story fades. And in the frozen north, beyond the wall, in places where the cold never lifts and the ice never melts, perhaps the White Walkers remember. Perhaps they remember that once, long ago, one of their own stood beside a human in rule. Perhaps they remember that humans can be corrupted, can be turned, can be made to serve the darkness. The Night's King's story is a tragedy, ultimately. A man who knew no fear, who thought himself strong enough to love the unliving, who believed he could control forces beyond human understanding. And in his hubris, he nearly destroyed the very order he had sworn to serve, nearly provided the White Walkers with a foothold in the world of men that could have doomed them all. His name is forgotten. His deeds are remembered only in fragments and warnings. But the lesson remains. Some things should not be loved. Some boundaries should not be crossed. And the Watch must never, ever be betrayed from within. If you're to defend against an enemy, you must first understand them. You must know their strengths and weaknesses, their capabilities and limitations. The White Walkers, shrouded as they are in legend and fear, are difficult to understand with any certainty. What we know comes from ancient texts, from half-remembered encounters during the long night, and from the tales passed down through thousands of years of telling and retelling. But patterns emerge from these stories, a picture of creatures both terrifying and alien, possessing powers that seem to defy natural law. Let's begin with their appearance, because the very sight of a White Walker is said to be enough to freeze the courage in a man's heart. They are humanoid in shape, standing taller than most men, with a presence that seems to command attention and instill dread in equal measure. Their flesh is described in the oldest accounts as pale as milk, but this is not the pallor of the sick or the dead. This is something else, a whiteness that seems to drink in color and light, that makes the walker appear almost translucent, like ice given form and will. Their eyes are perhaps their most striking feature, and the one detail that remains consistent across every account. Blue. Not the blue of the summer sky or the warm blue of sapphires, but a cold, glowing blue, bright as blue stars, burning like ice. These eyes are said to pierce through darkness, to see in the deepest night as clearly as men see in daylight. When a white walker looks at you, the stories say, you feel that gaze like winter wind cutting through your warmest cloak, reaching deep inside you to freeze the very core of your being. They move with an alien grace, each motion deliberate and purposeful, like dancers or predators who have perfect control of their bodies. There's no wasted movement, no uncertainty in their actions. When they walk, they make no sound, their footsteps silent on snow and ice. This silence is said to be one of their most unnerving qualities. To see them approaching across the snow, these tall, pale figures with their burning blue eyes, and to hear nothing, no footfall, no breath, just the sound of your own heart hammering in your chest. Their blood, according to the few accounts that describe wounded white walkers, is not red like human blood. It's blue, pale blue like glacial ice, and when it touches the ground, it seems to freeze whatever it contacts. In death, if death is even the right word, a white walker doesn't bleed out or fall like a man. Instead, they shatter, their bodies breaking apart into thousands of glittering ice shards that melt away to nothing, leaving no corpse behind to prove they ever existed. The White Walkers carry weapons forged from ice, but these are not crude clubs or simple spears. They wield swords that are described as thin as needles, sharp as razors, and as clear as crystal. These blades are said to be harder than any steel, capable of cutting through armor and flesh with equal ease. When a White Walker's ice sword strikes conventional steel, the steel becomes brittle and shatters, the supernatural cold making the metal as fragile as glass. But weapons are only part of what makes the White Walkers so dangerous. Their most terrible power is their command over the dead. When a White Walker gestures at a corpse, whether that corpse is fresh or ancient, whether it died from violence or disease or simple old age, it rises again as a white. These whites become servants of the Walker's will, mindless but obedient, capable of following simple commands and fighting with a strength that no longer feels pain or fear. The creation of whites is what makes the White Walker's army so terrifying. Every battle against them becomes a nightmare calculation. Kill 100 whites, and 100 of your own dead might rise to fight for the enemy. The army of the dead grows with every engagement, feeding on the very people trying to stop it, and the whites, unlike the walkers themselves, can be created in virtually unlimited numbers. Every corpse is a potential soldier, every graveyard a potential barracks, every battlefield a recruiting ground for the army of the dead. The cold that surrounds the White Walkers is not merely the absence of warmth, but an active, aggressive force. When they approach, the temperature plummets. Frost forms on every surface. Breath turns to clouds of ice crystals in the air. Water freezes solid. Plants die and shrivel, and the warmth seems to be sucked out of everything living. This cold is so intense that it can kill in moments, freezing a man solid where he stands, turning living flesh into brittle ice. There's evidence to suggest that the White Walkers can control weather itself, or at least influence it. The terrible storms that accompanied their march south during the long night, the blizzards that buried villages and made travel impossible, may not have been natural weather, but rather manifestations of the Walkers' power. They bring winter with them, or perhaps more accurately, they are winter given form and purpose. But for all their terrifying power, the White Walkers do have weaknesses. These weaknesses, discovered during the long night and passed down through legend, are crucial to understanding how they might be fought. Dragon glass, also called obsidian, is one of the few substances that can destroy a White Walker. When dragon glass pierces a walker's flesh, the creature shatters instantly, breaking apart into those 1,000 ice shards. Why dragon glass has this effect is unknown. Whether it's the volcanic origin of the substance, some magical property inherent in it, or perhaps simply because it was dragon glass that created the first White Walker, and thus dragon glass can unmake them. Valyrian steel, that mysterious metal forged with dragonfire and magic in the old Valyrian Empire, has a similar effect. When a Valyrian steel blade cuts into a White Walker, the creature shatters just as surely as with dragon glass. Valyrian steel is incredibly rare, with most swords lost or destroyed over the centuries, but those that remain are powerful weapons against the ultimate enemy. Fire affects the White Walkers, though its effectiveness is debated in the old texts. Some stories say that fire will dismay them, which suggests it causes them distress, but may not destroy them outright. The whites they command are certainly vulnerable to fire. Burning them completely is one of the few reliable ways to stop them. But whether fire can kill a White Walker directly, or merely repels them, is unclear from the fragmentary accounts. What the old texts are clear about is that conventional weapons, normal steel swords, iron arrows, bronze axes, are useless against White Walkers. Strike at them with such weapons, and either the weapon will shatter from the cold, or it will simply pass through the walker without effect. Only the special materials, dragon glass, Valyrian steel, and possibly dragonfire, can truly harm them. The White Walkers have another ability that's hinted at in the darker legends, the power to convert living humans into more of their kind. This is separate from their raising of the dead as whites. According to some stories, the Walkers take male infants and through some dark ritual transform them into new White Walkers. If true, this would mean the White Walkers can reproduce after a fashion, creating more of their kind from human stock, ensuring their species can grow in number. There are suggestions in the oldest tales that the White Walkers possess their own language, a tongue that sounds like the cracking of ice on a winter lake, like glaciers carving, like the snap and break of frozen branches. No human has ever learned to speak this language, if it is indeed a language, and not merely sounds without meaning. Whether the White Walkers communicate among themselves through speech, or through some other method, perhaps a hive mind, perhaps simply an shared understanding of purpose, remains unknown. What is clear is that the White Walkers are intelligent. They're not mindless forces of nature like a blizzard or an avalanche. They plan, they strategize, they pursue goals and adapt to opposition. During the long night, they demonstrated an understanding of tactics, avoiding areas of strength and probing for weakness, surrounding and besieging settlements rather than simply throwing their forces against walls. This intelligence makes them far more dangerous than any mere monster could ever be. Their purpose, their motivation for the war they wage against all living things, is perhaps the greatest mystery. Do they simply seek to expand their domain, to transform the world into a frozen wasteland suitable for their kind? Are they driven by some directive or command given to them when they were created? Do they hate the living because life itself is anathema to their nature? Or is there some deeper reason, some goal or purpose that humans simply cannot comprehend? The White Walkers are, in every sense, the antithesis of life. Where life is warm, they are cold. Where life is ever-changing, they are eternal and unchanging. Where life brings color and sound and motion, they bring a frozen silence and a whiteness that devours all color. They are not evil in the way we understand human evil, motivated by greed or ambition or cruelty. They are simply the opposite of everything that lives and breathes and grows, and that, perhaps, is what makes them most terrifying. You cannot reason with them, cannot negotiate or find common ground. There is no diplomacy possible with the White Walkers, no treaty that can be signed, no understanding that can be reached. They are winter given form, and winter cares nothing for the prayers or fears or hopes of humanity. Understanding the White Walkers is essential to any hope of defeating them. But understanding them also means facing the reality of what they are. An enemy that cannot be bargained with, cannot be reformed, cannot be anything other than what they were made to be. The ultimate enemy, patient and cold, and absolutely certain that given time enough, winter always wins in the end. The defeat of the White Walkers at the end of the long night was not their destruction, merely their retreat. They withdrew to the uttermost north, to the lands of always winter where no human dared venture, and there they waited. This fundamental truth has echoed through the ages in the form of prophecies and warnings, predictions that one day when the world least expects it, the White Walkers would return and the long night would descend once more. The most prominent of these prophecies comes from the far east, from the ancient city of Asshai at the edge of the known world, where the Shadowlands begin and the very sun seems dimmer. The priests and priestesses of the Lord of Light, the red god Rulla, have preserved prophecies dating back more than 5,000 years, written in ancient texts and passed down through their order with meticulous care. Central to these prophecies is the figure known as the prince that was promised, though the Asshai priests more commonly call him by his ancient name, Azor Ahai Reborn. The prophecy foretells that when the stars bleed and darkness gathers, when winter comes to claim the world again, the hero will be reborn to lead humanity in a second war against the darkness. The signs of Azor Ahai's return are specific, though subject to interpretation. The prophecy states that the prince that was promised will be born beneath a bleeding star, born amid salt and smoke. They will wake dragons out of stone, bringing back to the world creatures of fire and magic that have not been seen in generations, and they will forge or find Lightbringer again, that legendary sword that drove back the darkness in the first long night. But here's where it becomes fascinating and complex. The Valyrian language, in which many of these prophecies were originally written, uses a word for prince that is gender neutral. The prophecy could just as easily refer to a princess as to a prince, a queen as to a king. For thousands of years, scholars assumed the hero would be male because that's what princes were. But the prophecy itself makes no such distinction, opening the possibility that the savior could be anyone, of any gender, who fits the other criteria. Melisandre, a red priestess of R'hllor, is one of many who have sought to identify Azor Ahai reborn in the current age. She looked for someone who fit the signs, born amid salt and smoke, connected to fire and light, a leader who could unite humanity against the darkness. Different interpreters have identified different candidates, each finding ways to make the prophecy fit their chosen champion. This flexibility of interpretation is both the prophecy's strength and its weakness. It gives hope that the hero will come when needed, but also creates the possibility of following false messiahs. The prophecy also speaks of a darkness gathering, of a long summer followed by a terrible winter, of signs in the sky and portents in the land. The long night, it warns, will come again. The White Walkers will march south once more, and when they do, the prince that was promised will stand against them with Lightbringer burning in their hand, leading the forces of light against the armies of darkness. But not all the prophecies come from Ashai or the Red Priests. In Westeros itself, warnings and predictions have been passed down through the ages, sometimes in the form of prophecies, sometimes simply as wisdom and tradition. The Starks of Winterfell, the great house that has ruled the North since the Age of Heroes, have a house motto that's more than just words. Winter is coming. It's not a threat or a boast like the mottos of other houses. It's a warning, a reminder, a constant recognition that no matter how warm and pleasant the summer, no matter how long peace has lasted, winter will always return. And in that winter, in that cold darkness, the old enemies might wake and march south again. Some suggest that this is why the Starks have always taken the threat of the White Walkers more seriously than the southern kingdoms, why they've supported the Night's Watch even as it fell into disrepute elsewhere, why they've preserved the old stories and legends when others dismissed them as children's tales. The Starks remember. They've kept the memory alive through 8,000 years of peace, maintained their vigil, passed down the warnings from father to son, mother to daughter, generation after generation. There's another prophecy, more obscure and harder to verify, about a warrior who will emerge during the second long night. This figure is sometimes called the last hero reborn, sometimes conflated with Azor Ahai, sometimes described as an entirely separate individual. According to these fragmented predictions, this warrior will lead a desperate quest, just as the original last hero did, seeking ancient knowledge and forming alliances with unlikely allies to turn the tide against the darkness. The children of the forest, or what remains of them, have their own prophecies. According to the few accounts that exist of their predictions, they foresaw that the White Walkers they created would indeed return, that the weapon they forged in desperation would come back to haunt the world. Some versions of their prophecy suggest that only a combination of the old magic and the new, the magic of the children working in concert with the fire of dragons, can truly defeat the White Walkers and end the threat they pose forever. The wise women and woods witches of the north, those who still follow the old ways and worship the old gods, have passed down their own warnings. They speak of signs that will herald the return of the White Walkers, summers that stretch longer than they should, followed by winters of unprecedented severity. They tell of the dead walking, of cold winds blowing from the north, of direwolves appearing south of the wall for the first time in generations. All these signs, they say, point to the same conclusion. The White Walkers are stirring in their frozen fastness, preparing to march south once more. Perhaps most chilling are the prophecies about what will happen if the White Walkers are not stopped this time. The Red Priests speak of a night that never ends, a darkness that will fall across the world and never lift. They describe a world locked in eternal winter, all warmth extinguished, all life frozen and dead. The White Walkers, they say, will not be content with merely invading the lands of men as they did before. This time, they will seek to transform the entire world into a frozen wasteland, a realm of ice and death, where only they and their white servants exist. The prophecies also warn about the difficulty of recognizing the true threat when it arrives. They suggest that when the White Walkers return, humanity will be divided, fighting amongst itself over thrones and kingdoms and petty grievances. The real enemy, the existential threat, will be ignored or dismissed because people will be too caught up in their immediate concerns to see the danger approaching from the north. This, perhaps, is the most frustrating aspect of prophecy. Even when the warnings are clear, even when the signs are manifesting exactly as predicted, people often refuse to see what's right in front of them. It's more comfortable to believe that the old stories are just stories, that the monsters are just myths, that the warnings are just superstitious nonsense, until it's too late. The prophecies speak of a war to come, a second battle for the dawn that will determine the fate not just of Westeros, but of all humanity. They describe it as a conflict that will make the wars of kings and queens seem like children's squabbles by comparison. This will be a war for survival itself, a struggle to preserve the very concept of life and warmth and light against an enemy that seeks to extinguish all three forever. And here's the terrible paradox at the heart of all these prophecies. They provide hope that heroes will arise, that champions will stand against the darkness, that there's a path to victory. But they also make clear just how difficult that path will be, how much sacrifice will be required, how close the world will come to falling into eternal winter before salvation comes, if it comes at all. The red priests and priestesses, the woods witches, the wise men who study the old texts, all agree on one thing. The prophecies are not guarantees. They describe what could happen, what should happen, what the hero must do to save the world. But prophecies can fail. Heroes can fall. The prince that was promised might not arrive in time, or might not be recognized, or might be defeated despite their best efforts. The prophecies are warnings and hope intertwined. They tell us that the darkness will return, that the White Walkers will march south again, that another long night is coming. But they also tell us that there's a chance, a possibility, that the right person in the right place at the right time might just be able to stop them. That Lightbringer might burn once more, that the dawn might come again, no matter how long the night. As long as someone remembers the prophecies, as long as someone heeds the warnings, there's hope. But hope is not the same as certainty, and prophecy is not the same as destiny. The future remains unwritten, and when the cold winds begin to blow from the north, when the dead start walking and the White Walkers march, humanity will have to fight for its survival just as it did 8,000 years ago. The prophecies can guide, they can warn, they can offer hope in the darkest hours, but they cannot win the war. That will require blood and courage and sacrifice, just as it did before. The prophecies are just words. What matters is what people do when those words become reality. While scholars and meisters debate the historical truth of the White Walkers, while priests and priestesses interpret prophecies, the common folk of Westeros and beyond have kept the memory alive in a different way. Through folk tales and nursery stories, through warnings whispered by mothers to their children, through campfire tales told to make the listener's skin prickle with fear. These folk traditions, varied and colourful as they are, preserve truths that might otherwise be lost. In the north of Westeros, where the White Walkers are most remembered, the tales take on a particular character. They're not abstract warnings about distant threats, but concrete stories about what happens when you venture too far into the cold, when you disrespect the old ways, when you forget that winter is always coming. Old Nan, that repository of northern folklore, whose tales have been passed down through countless generations, tells stories that capture the true terror of the White Walkers. She describes them as the white shadows, or cold shadows, that move through the woods in the depths of winter. In her telling, they're not just dangerous, but actively malevolent, seeking out the warmth and life to extinguish it. She speaks of riders on dead horses, of spiders the size of hounds with legs like twisted black iron, of cold winds that can freeze a man's breath in his lungs. Her stories serve a practical purpose. They keep children close to home during winter, discourage them from wandering into the forests alone, teach them to respect the cold and the dark. Fear is for the winter, she would say, when the snows fall 100 feet deep. Fear is for the long night, when the sun hides for years and children are born and live and die all in darkness. These aren't just scary stories to Old Nan. They're warnings based on ancestral memory, lessons that have kept her family alive through countless winters. The wildlings, or free folk, who live beyond the wall in the very lands the White Walkers once ruled, have their own rich tradition of tales about the Cold Ones, as they sometimes call them. Their stories are different in character from those south of the wall, shaped by the reality of living in proximity to the lands of always winter. The free folk tell of entire villages found empty in the deep of winter, all the inhabitants gone, nothing left but silence and a cold that seems to emanate from the very stones. They speak of hunters who venture too far north and return changed, their eyes bright blue, their skin cold, no longer quite human. In some versions, these transformed hunters lead the White Walkers back to their villages, betraying their own people. There are tales among the free folk about the necessity of burning the dead. This isn't just a practical consideration to prevent disease, but a sacred duty. Leave a corpse unburned in the lands beyond the wall, the stories warn, and it might rise again to serve the cold ones. The worst sin a person can commit, in some wildling traditions, is to leave a fallen companion unburned, dooming them to walk again as a wight in service to the enemy. One particularly haunting folktale from beyond the wall speaks of a village that tried to make peace with the White Walkers. Desperate and starving during a terrible winter, the village elders decided to offer tribute, food, weapons, and worst of all, their newborn children, in exchange for being left alone. The White Walkers accepted the tribute, the story says. They took the offerings and left the village standing. But when spring finally came and outsiders reached the village, they found everyone frozen solid, standing or sitting where they had been when the cold took them. Perfect ice statues with expressions of terror on their faces. The White Walkers had kept their bargain. They hadn't attacked the village. They'd simply waited for winter to do their work for them. In the eastern continent of Essos, the stories take on different forms, but often describe similar threats. In the lands around the Shivering Sea, they tell of the ice demons that came from the north during the ancient darkness. The Dothraki, those horse warriors of the Great Grass Sea, have legends of a time when even the vast plains froze, when their ancestors had to flee south to survive. They speak of the frozen dead that pursued them, of cold winds that killed entire Khalasars. In Yeti, at the far eastern edge of the known world, the ancient texts speak of the Lion of Night, the demon that was unleashed when the Maiden Maid of Light turned her back on the world. The Yitai legends describe a darkness that lasted for a generation and cold that froze the very oceans. They tell of the 5 forts, massive fortifications in the far north of their continent that were built, they claim, to keep out the demons from the grey waste beyond. Some scholars have noted the parallels between these 5 forts and Westeros' wall, suggesting that perhaps the Long Night was truly a global catastrophe affecting lands separated by vast oceans. The Rhoynar, before their culture was destroyed and they fled to Dawn, had legends of the Long Night as well. Their stories speak of the Great Rhoyne River freezing solid from north to south, of ice demons walking across the frozen water, of the goddess Mother Rhoyne herself rising to sing a song that drove back the cold. These tales emphasize the power of water and flowing rivers as protection against the ice and frost, which is why the Rhoynar considered their river sacred. Even in distant Asshai, that mysterious city by the shadow where magic runs deep and strange things walk the streets, they have their own versions of the story. The Asshai tales speak of the darkness that fell across the world and the hero with the burning sword who drove it back. Their versions often include more mystical elements, prophecies and visions, sacrifices and sorcery, than the more straightforward Westerosi accounts. What's striking about all these regional variations is how they agree on the fundamental elements despite the vast distances separating these cultures. Darkness fell, cold came, the dead walked, and somehow, through desperate courage and terrible sacrifice, humanity survived. These shared elements across cultures that had no contact with each other suggest that the Long Night was a real global event rather than a localized catastrophe that grew in the telling. In the north of Westeros, mothers still frighten their children into obedience with warnings about the White Walkers. Eat your supper, or the White Shadows will get you. Don't wander in the woods alone, or the cold ones will take you. Be home before dark, or the others will find you. These casual invocations of the White Walkers in daily life keep the memory alive even among those who don't believe the stories are literally true. There are also folk traditions about how to protect yourself from the White Walkers should you encounter them. Some say that fire will always drive them back, so never let your fire go out in the deep winter. Others claim that weirwood trees provide protection, that the old gods watch through the carved faces and won't let the White Walkers harm those sheltering near their trees. Still others suggest that running water can stop them, that they cannot cross a flowing stream or river. The reliability of such folk protections is questionable, but they provide psychological comfort if nothing else. They give people the illusion of control in the face of an enemy that seems unstoppable, offer rules and rituals that might just save your life if the worst comes to pass. Some of the darkest folk tales aren't about encountering the White Walkers, but about becoming like them, about the transformation that can occur when someone is exposed to that terrible cold for too long. These stories often feature a hunter or ranger who gets lost in a blizzard, who finds shelter in a strange place, who accepts help from a beautiful woman with pale skin and strange eyes. By the time the protagonist realizes the danger, it's too late. They've been changed, corrupted, drawn into the cold, until they can never return to the warmth of human company. These transformation tales serve as warnings about the insidious nature of the White Walker threat. It's not just about armies marching and battles being fought. It's about the cold getting inside you, about losing yourself bit by bit until you're no longer the person you once were. It's about the danger of being seduced by the cold, of finding a strange peace in the frozen wastes, of giving up the struggle to stay warm and alive. The folk tales, with all their regional variations and accumulated embellishments, preserve something that dry historical accounts cannot: the emotional truth of what the White Walkers represent. They embody our deepest fears about winter and cold, about darkness and death, about losing our humanity and becoming something other than what we are. They represent the terrifying possibility that all our warmth and life and civilization might be nothing more than a temporary respite before the cold claims everything. And perhaps most importantly, the folktales keep the memory alive. While scholars might debate whether the White Walkers ever existed, while southern lords might dismiss them as superstition, the folk traditions ensure that somewhere someone remembers. Somewhere a mother is warning her child about the cold ones. Somewhere a storyteller is describing the white shadows that move through winter woods. Somewhere the knowledge is being passed down that the White Walkers were real, are real, and might come again. When the cold winds start blowing from the north, when the dead start walking and the White Walkers march south, again, it won't be the scholars or the lords who are prepared. It will be the common folk who listened to their grandmothers' tales, who remembered the warnings, who never quite stopped believing that winter is always coming, and that in the deep winter, terrible things wake and walk. At the very top of the known world, beyond the wall, beyond even the furthest ranging of the Night's Watch or the wildlings, lies a region that appears on no reliable maps and features in no trustworthy accounts. This is the land of always winter, the uttermost north, the frozen waste from which the White Walkers emerged and to which they retreated after their defeat in the long night. It is a place of permanent cold, where the ice never melts and the darkness seems thicker somehow, more substantial, as if the very light fears to venture there. What do we actually know about the lands of always winter? Precious little, truth be told. No explorer has ventured there and returned to tell comprehensive tales. The few accounts we have come from rangers who glimpsed its borders from afar, from wildlings who claim to have seen its southern reaches, from ancient texts that describe what the region was like 8,000 years ago. From these fragments, we can piece together a picture, though whether that picture is accurate or simply what we imagine such a terrible place must be like is impossible to say. The landscape of the lands of always winter is said to be utterly inimical to life. The ground is frozen so deeply, so completely, that it rings like stone when struck. No plant grows there, no animal ventures into its depths willingly. The sky above is described as a pale, sickly color, sometimes blue-white with ice crystals suspended in the air, sometimes a gray so deep it's nearly black. The sun, when it appears at all, seems weak and distant, providing no warmth, just a dim glow that makes the ice fields glitter with eerie beauty. The cold itself is beyond anything found in even the harshest normal winter. This is not merely the absence of heat, but a presence in itself, an aggressive force that seeks out any warmth and extinguishes it. Exposed flesh freezes in moments. Metal becomes so cold that touching it will instantly bond skin to surface, tearing away flesh when you try to pull free. The air itself can kill you, freezing your lungs with each breath until you can no longer draw air at all. The terrain is varied in the way that ice and snow can create variety. There are vast, flat expanses where the wind has scoured the snow into patterns like frozen waves. There are mountains of ice, towering peaks that gleam pale blue and white, crackling and groaning as they shift infinitesimally over the centuries. There are crevasses so deep that those who fall into them are never found, ice caves that lead down into darkness, glaciers slowly grinding their way across the barren land. Some accounts speak of structures in the lands of always winter, though whether these are natural formations or something built is unclear. They describe what might be cities or fortresses, great spires and domes made entirely of ice, shaped with a precision that seems beyond natural weathering. If true, these structures would suggest that the White Walkers have their own civilization, their own architecture, their own aesthetic sense. But they might also simply be unusually regular ice formations, given meaning by observers desperate to understand the enemy's nature. The most persistent rumor about the lands of always winter concerns what might be called the White Walkers' stronghold, or center of power. According to the most ancient texts, somewhere in those frozen wastes lies a place where the White Walkers gather, where they were first created, or where they retreated after the long night. Some describe it as a frozen palace, others as a grove of weirwood trees locked forever in ice. A few accounts speak of a great chasm or pit, a hole in the world itself where the cold seems to originate, as if there's some source of the supernatural winter that emanates from a single point. If such a place exists, finding and destroying it might be key to defeating the White Walkers permanently, but reaching it would require surviving the journey through the lands of always winter, something no human has ever accomplished. The few who have ventured even a short distance into those regions describe a landscape of such hostile alienness that it seems to belong to a different world entirely, a world where life has no place, and warmth is an aberration to be corrected. There are legends among the wildlings about what else might inhabit the lands of always winter besides the White Walkers themselves. They speak of ice spiders as big as hounds, creatures with legs like twisted black iron and eyes that glow with cold blue light. These spiders are said to serve the White Walkers as mounts or beasts of burden, scuttling across the ice with terrible speed, able to climb sheer walls of ice and attack from any direction. Whether ice spiders actually exist is unknown. No reliable witness has reported seeing one in recorded history. They might be purely legendary, creatures of nightmare rather than reality, or they might be real but rare, emerging only during the long night when the White Walkers march in force. The uncertainty itself is part of what makes the lands of always winter so terrifying. We don't know what's there, what creatures might inhabit it, what horrors might emerge if the White Walkers decide to invade again. Some scholars have theorized about what might sustain the White Walkers in such a barren region. Do they eat? Do they drink? Do they require any sustenance at all? Or are they sustained purely by magic, creatures that exist outside the normal rules that govern living things? The fact that they don't seem to age, that they don't seem to sicken or weaken, suggests they might not be alive in any conventional sense. They might simply exist, eternally unchanged, eternally patient, waiting in their frozen realm for the next opportunity to sweep south and claim the world of warmth and life. There are those who believe that the lands of always winter weren't always as they are now, that once, long ago, this region was more habitable. They point to references in the oldest text to forests that once grew in the far north, to rivers that flowed before they froze solid and never thawed. According to this theory, the creation of the White Walkers somehow transformed the region, or perhaps the White Walkers themselves created the perpetual winter, making the land into something that suited their nature. If that's true, it raises a terrifying possibility. If the White Walkers succeeded in conquering the south, if they were never driven back, would they transform all of Westeros into another land of always winter? Would they freeze the rivers, kill the forests, turn the entire continent into a frozen wasteland suitable only for themselves and their white servants. The legends of the long night suggest this might indeed be their goal, not merely to kill the living, but to fundamentally alter the world itself. The journey to the lands of always winter would be a quest of almost mythical difficulty. One would have to travel beyond the wall, through the haunted forest, and the regions where the wildlings fear to venture. Past the Frostfangs, those jagged mountains of ice and stone. Past the last scattered groves of trees, past the last hints of anything recognizable as life, into a realm where the rules of the natural world seem not to apply, where the cold is absolute and the darkness feels alive. What would one find there? The truth about the White Walkers, perhaps. The source of their power. The key to their destruction. Or perhaps just death. A cold and lonely death in a place where no one would ever find your frozen corpse. The lands of always winter keep their secrets well, protected by cold and distance, and the simple fact that no one who ventures deep into those regions ever returns. And yet, the knowledge that such a place exists, that there is a region of eternal winter from which the White Walkers can emerge whenever they choose, hangs over Westeros like a dark promise. The wall may keep them out for now. The Night's Watch may maintain their vigil. But the lands of always winter remain, patient and cold and eternal, waiting for the next long night to begin. As the fire burns low and the shadows lengthen around us, we come to the end of our journey through the frozen mythology of the White Walkers. We've traced their origins from the desperate act of the children of the forest, through the catastrophic long night that nearly ended all life, to the legends and prophecies that promise their return. We've walked the wall, heard the warnings of ancient heroes, and glimpsed the terrible beauty of the lands of always winter. What have we learned from these tales of ice and death? Perhaps most importantly, we've learned that the greatest threats sometimes come from the most desperate solutions, that weapons created in haste can turn against their makers, that fear and desperation can lead us to make choices whose consequences echo through millennia. The White Walkers are more than just monsters in a story. They represent something fundamental about the human condition. Our fear of the cold and dark, our struggle against the dying of the light, our eternal battle to preserve warmth and life in a world that tends toward entropy and cold. They embody winter in its most absolute form, not just a season, but a state of being, an ending that promises to be final and total. Yet the stories also give us hope. They remind us that even in the darkest night, even when the cold seems absolute and the enemy unstoppable, humanity can endure. Heroes can arise. Sacrifices can be made. The dawn can come again, no matter how long the night. The wall still stands. The Night's Watch still keeps its vigil. The knowledge is still passed down from generation to generation. And when the cold winds blow from the north again, when the dead start walking and the White Walkers emerge from their frozen fastness, there will be those who remember, who believe, who stand ready to fight. The folktales and legends we've explored tonight are more than just entertainment or historical curiosity. They're warnings, preserved through thousands of years of retelling, reminding us that winter is always coming, that the darkness is always waiting, that the price of survival is eternal vigilance. The mothers who frighten their children with tales of the cold ones, the rangers who share stories around campfires, the meisters who preserve the old texts, all are keeping alive the memory of a threat that most of the world has forgotten, but that has never truly gone away. As you return to the warmth of your everyday life, perhaps you'll carry some of these tales with you. Perhaps you'll look at winter a bit differently. Feel the cold with a new awareness. Understand that the struggle between warmth and cold, life and death, light and darkness is eternal and ongoing. Perhaps you'll remember that the greatest heroes are often those who simply refuse to surrender, who keep fighting even when victory seems impossible, who maintain hope in the darkest hours. The White Walkers wait in their frozen lands, patient and cold and eternal. But humanity endures, warm-blooded and determined, carrying fire and hope into the darkness. And in that eternal struggle lies the true heart of these stories, not just the terror of what lurks in the cold, but the courage of those who face it anyway. So until we meet again, dear listeners, stay warm. Keep your fires burning bright. Remember the lessons of the long night. And if you ever hear the cold winds blowing from the north, if you ever see pale figures moving through winter woods, if you ever encounter eyes that burn with cold blue light, remember everything we've discussed tonight. If you've enjoyed this journey into the frozen mythology of the White Walkers, I'd be grateful if you take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with others who appreciate the deeper lore of fantasy worlds, who understand that the best stories often contain truths that transcend their fictional origins. Your support helps me continue exploring these rich mythologies and sharing them with fellow seekers of forgotten knowledge. Stay curious, my friends, stay warm, and never forget, winter is always coming. Until next time, this is the Midnight Lawkeeper, signing off from our cozy sanctuary, where the stories live eternal and the fire never quite goes out. Safe travels through your own long nights, and may the dawn always find you still standing, still fighting, still hoping for the light. Good night.